Welcome to the Midnight Storyteller channel. Tonight, we present a soothing bedtime reading of Kokoro by Natsume Soseki. This is the second video in the series. If you haven't listened to the first video, please click the link in the description below. Now please enjoy the second video. Kokoro by Natsume Soseki, Part 3, Sensei and His Testament, Chapter 1. This summer, I received 2 or 3 letters from you. I recall that the one in which you wrote about wanting to secure a significant position in Tokyo was the second one I received. When I read it, I felt the need to do something. At the very least, I thought I should respond. But to confess, I did nothing regarding your request. As you know, I live in such isolation that saying I live alone in the world would be more accurate than saying my social circle is narrow. Therefore, there was absolutely no room for me to make such efforts. But that's not the issue. The truth is, I was troubled by what to do with myself. Should I continue to exist like a mummy left behind in human society, or... Whenever I repeated the words "or" in my mind at that time, I shuddered. Like someone who rushes to the edge of a cliff and suddenly peers into an unseen abyss. I was cowardly, and like many cowardly people, I was deeply troubled. Regrettably, at that time, it's no exaggeration to say that you barely existed to me. To go a step further, your position, your livelihood, all these things were meaningless to me. I didn't care at all. I was in no state to think about such things. I placed your letter in the drawer and kept pondering. Why would someone with a suitable family fortune struggle so much for a position after graduation? I rather felt bitter about giving you such a glance from afar. I'm confessing this to you to explain why I did not reply to you. I'm not deliberately using harsh words to anger you. I trust you'll understand my true intention once you read further. In any case, since I remained silent when I should have at least greeted you, I want to apologize for this neglect in front of you. Afterwards, I sent you a telegram. To be honest, I wanted to see you for a bit at that time. Then, I wanted to tell you about my past as you wished. You replied via telegram that you couldn't come to Tokyo, and I would, as disappointed, staring at that telegram for a long time. You must have felt dissatisfied with just the telegram, as you sent a long letter later, which made me understand why you couldn't come to Tokyo. I don't think you are an impolite person at all. How could you leave home ignoring your dear father's illness? The inappropriate attitude is mine, acting as if I had forgotten about your father's life and death. Indeed, when I sent that telegram, I had forgotten about your father. Yet when you were in Tokyo, I had advised you to be careful because it was a serious illness. I am such a contradictory person. Perhaps it's not my brain, but my past that pressures me into becoming such a contradictory person. I acknowledge this point fully. You must forgive me. When I read your last letter, yes, the last one from you, I felt I had done something wrong. So I considered sending a reply explaining this, and I began to write, but I stopped without writing a single line. If I were to write, I wanted to write this letter, and it was a bit too early to write this letter, so I stopped. The reason I sent a simple telegram saying not to come was because of that. Chapter 2. I then started writing this letter. For someone who seldom holds a pen, it was a heavy burden that things did not proceed as I thought. I almost abandoned my duty to you. However, no matter how much I decided to stop and put down the pen, it was useless. Within an hour, I wanted to write again. You might think this reflects my character that values fulfilling duties. I won't deny it. As you know, I am a solitary person with almost no dealings with the world, so I don't have many duties rooted in any direction. Intentionally or naturally, I lived a life where I cut such obligations as much as possible. But it's not because I was indifferent to duty that I ended up like this. Rather, I was too sensitive and lacked the energy to endure the stimuli, resulting in a passive life. Therefore, once I make a promise, not fulfilling it is extremely unpleasant. To avoid this unpleasant feeling towards you, I had to pick up the pen again. Moreover, I want to write. Apart from duty, I want to write about my past. My past is my unique experience, so it can be considered my sole possession. It might be said that it would be a waste to die without sharing it with anyone. I have some of that feeling. However, I would rather bury my experience with my life than give it to someone who cannot accept it. Indeed, if you didn't exist, my past would have remained my past and wouldn't have become anyone else's knowledge, even indirectly. Among the tens of millions of Japanese people, I only want to tell you my past, because you are earnest, because you said you want to learn serious lessons from life itself. I will cast the dark shadows of my life on your head without hesitation. But don't be afraid. Look closely at the darkness and grasp what might be useful to you from it. My darkness is, of course, ethical darkness. I was born ethically. I was raised ethically. My ethical thinking might differ greatly from that of the younger generation today. But no matter how wrong it is, tea is my own. It's not a rented costume I borrowed temporarily. Therefore, I think it might be somewhat useful to you, who is about to develop further. You remember how you often debated modern ideological issues with me. You also know my attitude towards them. I didn't despise your opinions, but I couldn't respect them either. Your thoughts had no background, and you were too young to have your own past. I sometimes laughed. You occasionally showed me a discontented face. Finally, you urged me to unfold my past like a picture scroll before you. At that time, I first respected you in my heart, because you showed the determination to grab something living from inside me without hesitation, because you tried to split my heart open and drink the warm blood flowing from it. At that time, I was still alive. I was afraid of dying. So I deferred your request to another day. Now I am trying to break my own heart and splash its blood onto your face. If new life can be born in your chest when my heartbeat stops, I will be satisfied. Chapter 3. I lost my parents before I turned 20. As my wife might have mentioned to you, they died of the same illness. And as she probably caused you to doubt, they died almost simultaneously. In fact, my father's illness was a dreadful enteric fever. It was transmitted to my mother who nursed him. I was the only son born between them. Our house had considerable wealth, so I was rather indulgently raised. Looking back at my past, I think if my parents had not died then, if at least one of them had stayed alive, I could have continued to maintain that carefree attitude. I was left bewildered after their deaths. I had neither knowledge nor experience nor discernment. When my father died, my mother couldn't be by his side. When my mother died, she didn't even know my father had passed. Whether she sensed it or, as others around her said, actually believed my father was recovering, I don't know. My mother merely entrusted everything to my uncle. Pointing to me, who was there, she said, "Please take care of this child." I had already received permission from my parents to go to Tokyo, so she seemed to mention it as well. When she added to Tokyo, my uncle immediately responded, "Don't worry, everything will be fine." My mother was a woman who could endure a high fever, and my uncle praised her to me, saying she was strong. But thinking about it now, I don't know if that was really her will. My mother knew the dreadful name of the disease my father contracted, and she knew she had caught it herself. But whether she believed she would certainly lose her life to it, there's still room for doubt. Moreover, my mother's words during high fever, no matter how clear and logical they were, often left no trace in her memory. But that's not the issue here. Just like this, I feel the need to explain and ponder things from various angles. This nature was already well developed in me back then. I should mention this to you from the beginning, but I think such an example, even though it has little direct relevance to the current issue, might be useful. Please read with that in mind. This disposition influenced my actions and behavior ethically, and I increasingly began to doubt the moral integrity of others. This certainly contributed significantly to my distress and anguish, so please remember that. Getting off track makes it harder to understand, so let's go back. Even compared to others in the same position, I might be somewhat more composed writing this long letter. The sound of trains heard when the world sleeps has ceased. Outside the shutters, the sad cries of insects faintly remind me of the autumn dew. My unaware wife sleeps innocently in the next room. As I write, each character forms with a sound on the pen's tip. I face the paper rather calmly. The pen might stray sideways due to my inexperience, but my head isn't confused, and my writing isn't erratic. Chapter 4. In any case, I was left alone and had no choice but to rely on my uncle as my mother instructed. My uncle took on everything and arranged for me to go to Tokyo as I wished. I entered a high school in Tokyo. The students at that time were much more savage and rough than they are now. I knew someone who got into a fight with a worker at night and injured the man's head with a geta. It was a drunken brawl, and during the fight, he lost his school cap to the other side. The name was clearly written on a white piece of cloth inside the cap. This made it a serious issue, and he was nearly reported to the school by the police. However, friends worked hard to resolve it without making it public. If I told you, who grew up in the current refined environment, about such violent acts, you'd probably find them foolish. I do as well. But they had a kind of simplicity that modern students lack. The monthly allowance I received from my uncle back then was much less than the tuition you receive from your father now. Of course, the cost of living was different. Yet I felt no lack. Moreover, compared to my classmates, I wasn't in a pitiable situation economically. In retrospect, I might have been envied, because besides the fixed monthly allowance, I could freely spend additional money for books. I loved buying books even then, and other expenses, as long as I requested it from my uncle. I trusted my uncle without knowing anything, and always respected him with gratitude. My uncle was a businessman. He also became a prefectural assembly member. That might explain his connections with political parties. He was my father's real younger brother, but he seemed to have developed in a completely different direction in terms of character. My father was a man who cherished and maintained the inheritance passed down from our ancestors. For pleasure, he enjoyed tea and flowers. He also loved reading poetry collections. He had many interests in antiques and art. Although our use was in the countryside, sometimes shopkeepers from the nearby city, about 2 miles away, where my uncle lived, would come to show my father hanging scrolls and incense burners. My father could be described as a man of means, a relatively refined country gentleman. So in terms of personality, there was a considerable gap between him and my outgoing uncle. Yet they got along very well. My father often praised my uncle, saying he was much more capable and reliable than himself. He used to say that those who inherit wealth from their parents inevitably become dull because they don't have to fight with the world. My mother heard these words too. I also heard them. It seemed like my father said it as advice for me. "You should remember this well," he said, looking at me. So I still remember it. How could I doubt my uncle, who was trusted and praised by my father? My uncle should have been a source of pride for me. After my parents' death, when I had to rely on him for everything, he became a necessary person for my existence. Chapter 5. When I returned home for the first time during summer vacation, my house, which had been desolate after my parents' death, had new occupants, my uncle and his wife. This was an arrangement made before I went to Tokyo. Since I was left alone with no one to stay in the house, there was no other choice. At that time, my uncle was involved in various companies in the city. He laughed, saying it was far more convenient for his business to stay in his current residence rather than move to my house 2 miles away. He had said this when we were discussing how to handle the house after my parents' death and my departure for Tokyo. My house had an old history and was somewhat known in the area. As you might also know, it's a big deal in the countryside to destroy or sell a historically significant house when there is an heir. Today, I wouldn't care much about such things, but back then, as a child, I was deeply troubled, wanting to go to Tokyo but feeling I had to leave the house as it was. My uncle reluctantly agreed to move into my vacant house. However, he asked to keep his current residence as well, and move back and forth between the two for convenience. I had no objections. I thought it would be fine as long as I could go to Tokyo under any conditions. As a child, I still longed for my hometown even after leaving it. I looked at my home with nostalgic eyes, like a traveler knowing there's a place to return to. Even though I longed for Tokyo, the feeling that I had to return home during vacations was strong. I studied hard and played joyfully, always dreaming of the home I could return to during vacations. I don't know how my uncle managed the 2 places during my absence. When I arrived, everyone was gathered under one roof. Children who usually went to school in the city were also brought to the countryside for a vacation. Everyone was happy to see me. I was also pleased to see the lively and cheerful house, even more so than when my parents were alive. My uncle removed his eldest son, who had taken over my former room, and let me use it. Even though there were plenty of other rooms, my uncle insisted that I stay in my house. Except for occasionally remembering my late parents, I spent that summer happily with my uncle's family, and then returned to Tokyo. The only dark shadow cast over my heart that summer was my uncle and aunt repeatedly urging me, who had just entered high school, to get married. They did this about 3 or 4 times. At first, I was just surprised by the suddenness. The second time, I clearly refused. The third time, I had to ask for their reasons. Their reasoning was simple. They wanted me to marry early, return to this house, and inherit my father's position. I thought it would be fine to return home during vacations. Inheriting my father's position required a wife. Both made sense, especially since I knew the rural circumstances. I understood. I didn't absolutely hate the idea, but having just gone to Tokyo for my studies, It seemed like a distant prospect. I didn't agree to my uncle's wish and left my house again. Chapter 6. I forgot about the marriage proposal. Looking around at the young faces surrounding me, none seemed domesticated. Everyone was free and appeared single. Even among these carefree individuals, some might have been forced by family circumstances to take a wife, but as a naive child I didn't notice. And those in such special circumstances probably avoided discussing their personal affairs to keep their student life separate. Looking back, I was already part of that group without realizing it. I continued my studies cheerfully and carefree. At the end of the school year, I packed my things and returned to my parents' graves in the countryside. As before, I saw my uncle's family in the house where my parents had lived. Again, I smelled the familiar scent of my hometown. It was still nostalgic to me, and a welcome change from the monotony of the school year. But amid this familiar scent that had raised me, my uncle suddenly brought up the marriage issue again. He repeated his previous arguments. The reason was the same, but unlike before, he had already found a suitable match. His daughter, my cousin. He said marrying her would be convenient for both sides, and that my father had discussed such matters while he was alive. I thought it would be convenient too. It was plausible that my father had such a conversation. But it wasn't something I had noticed until my uncle mentioned it. So I was surprised. Although I understood the logic, I was taken aback. Am I naive? Perhaps, but my indifference to my cousin was likely the main reason. I often visited my uncle's house in the city from a young age. I didn't just visit, but frequently stayed over. I was close to this cousin since then. You know that love rarely forms between siblings. I might be overextending this idea, but I believe that being too familiar with someone prevents the spark of love. Just as you can only appreciate the scent of incense when it's first lit, or savor alcohol at the first sip, the impulse of love has a similar critical point in time. Once you pass that point indifferently, the more familiar you become, the more affection grows, but the nerves for love gradually numb. No matter how I reconsidered, I couldn't bring myself to marry this cousin. My uncle said that if I insisted, we could postpone the marriage until I graduated. But he also said, a stitch in time saves 9, and preferred to have the wedding sooner. Since I didn't want the match, it made no difference. I refused again. My uncle looked displeased. My cousin cried. She wasn't sad because she couldn't marry me, but because, as a woman, being refused was painful. I knew that my cousin didn't love me just as I didn't love her. I went back to Tokyo again. Chapter 7. The third time I returned home was a year later, in the summer. I always eagerly left Tokyo as soon as the school exams ended. I missed my hometown that much. You know the feeling, don't you? The air, the scent of the land, and the vivid memories of parents. To me, spending 7 or 8 months a year in that cocoon, like a snake hibernating in a hole, was the warmest and most comforting feeling. I naively believed that I didn't need to worry much about the marriage issue with my cousin, refuse what I didn't like, and nothing would remain afterward. I believed this. So, despite not bending to my uncle's wishes, I was rather carefree. I hadn't worried about such matters over the past year and returned home with the same cheer. But when I arrived, my uncle's attitude had changed. He no longer welcomed me warmly. Still, my indulgent nature made me unaware of this for the first 4 or 5 days. Suddenly, something seemed off. It wasn't just my uncle. My aunt was strange, too. Even my cousin and my uncle's eldest son, who had just finished middle school and was about to enter a high school in Tokyo, seemed strange. As my nature compels me, I couldn't help but ponder. Why had my feelings changed? No, why had theirs? I suddenly suspected that my deceased parents might have somehow opened my eyes to the true nature of the world. I believed, somewhere deep in my heart, that they continued to love me even after death. Although I wasn't a stranger to reason, I still carried strong superstitions inherited from my ancestors. I probably still do. I went alone to the mountain and knelt before my parents' graves, half in mourning, half in gratitude. I prayed for my future happiness, feeling as if my destiny was still held in their hands beneath those cold stones. You might laugh. I don't mind if you do. But that's the kind of person I was. My world changed suddenly. But this wasn't my first experience of such change. When I was 16 or 17, discovering Fa, or the first time that beautiful things existed in the world, shocked me. I doubted my eyes repeatedly and rubbed them again and again. In my heart, I cried out, "Oh, how beautiful." At 16 or 17, both boys and girls are at the age when they begin to feel attraction. My newfound awareness made me see women as representatives of the world's beauty. Until then, I had never noticed their existence. Suddenly, my blind eyes opened to the opposite sex. From then on, my world was completely new. Noticing my uncle's attitude was exactly like this. It struck me suddenly. Without any premonition or preparation, it came unexpectedly. My uncle and his family appeared entirely different to me. I was shocked. I felt I couldn't leave things as they were and needed to understand my future better. Chapter 8. I felt I had to gain a thorough understanding of the family estate that I had left to my uncle's care to honor my deceased parents. My uncle, as he claimed, was always busy, seldom staying in one place. He spent 2 days at home, then 3 days in the city, going back and forth, spending his days restlessly. He frequently used the word busy. Without any suspicion, I believed he was indeed busy. I also sarcastically thought it wasn't fashionable these days not to appear busy. However, with a purpose of discussing time-consuming matters like the family estate, his busyness seemed like an excuse to avoid me. I had a hard time catching him. I heard rumors that my uncle had a mistress in the city. I heard this from an old friend from middle school. Having a mistress wasn't surprising for this uncle, but I was shocked since I had never heard such rumors while my father was alive. My friend told me various other things about my uncle. One of them, which particularly intensified my suspicion, was that despite nearly failing in business at one point, he had made a sudden comeback in the past few years. I finally confronted my uncle. Confrontation might be an exaggeration, but the tone naturally shifted in that direction. My uncle tried to treat me as a child throughout. I, on the other hand, approached him with suspicion from the start. It was never going to be an amicable resolution. Unfortunately, I'm in too much of a hurry now to detail the outcome of that confrontation. To be honest, I have more important matters to address. My pen has been eager to reach that point for a while now, and I'm holding it back with effort. Having lost the chance to meet you and speak quietly, I not only struggle with writing, but also feel the need to conserve precious time, which means omitting some details. You might remember when I once told you that there are no inherent villains in the world, that many good people can suddenly turn bad in certain situations, and you mustn't be complacent. At that time, you remarked that I was getting excited, and asked under what circumstances good people turn bad. When I replied, "Money," you looked dissatisfied. I vividly remember your dissatisfied face. Now I admit, I was thinking of my uncle then. I thought of him as an example of how ordinary people can turn bad when faced with money, and thus the world cannot be trusted. My answer might have seemed inadequate or cliched to you, someone striving to delve deep into the world of thought. But for me, it was a living answer. Indeed, I was excited. I believe it's more genuine to express a simple idea passionately than to articulate something novel with a cool head. It's because blood drives the body's movement. Words don't just create waves in the air, but can impact something more strongly and more profoundly. Chapter 9. In short, my uncle defrauded me of my estate. This happened effortlessly during the 3 years I was in Tokyo. Leaving everything to my uncle and being carefree was, in worldly terms, truly foolish. Evaluated from a higher perspective, one might say I was pure and noble. Reflecting on myself then, I regret not being born more cunning. Yet I also wish I could return to that untainted state. Remember, the me you know is the soiled me. If we call those with more years of dirt seniors, then I am certainly your senior. If I had married my uncle's daughter, as he wished, would the outcome have been materially beneficial for me? This needs no contemplation. My uncle cunningly tried to force his daughter on me. Rather than kindly ensuring the convenience of both families, he approached the marriage matter driven by much baser self-interest. Although I didn't hate my cousin, reflecting on it, I feel somewhat relieved that I refused. Either way, I would have been deceived, but refusing meant a slight triumph of my will over his intentions. However, it's a minor issue, almost laughable to someone uninvolved. Other relatives intervened between my uncle and me. I didn't trust these relatives at all. Not only did I distrust them, but I also viewed them as enemies. Once I realized my uncle had deceived me, I was convinced that others would also deceive me. My logic was, if even the uncle, who my father praised so highly, was like this, then the others surely would be too. Still, they consolidated everything that belonged to me. The sum was significantly less than I had anticipated. My choices were to accept it silently or sue my uncle. I was furious and conflicted. I also feared the lengthy time litigation would take. As a student, losing precious study time was extremely painful. After much deliberation, I decided to ask an old friend from middle school to convert everything into cash. Although my friend advised against it, I didn't listen. I decided to leave my hake, Omatown, permanently. I swore to never see my uncle's face again. Before leaving the country, I visited my parents' graves again. That was the last time I saw their graves. I will likely never see them again. My old friend handled my request as instructed, but it was a long time after I returned to Tokyo. Selling farmland in the countryside isn't easy, and one risks being undercut. The amount I received was much less than the market value. To confess, my inheritance consisted of some public bonds I took with me and the money sent by this friend later. The estate was already significantly diminished, and because I hadn't actively reduced it, it felt worse. Yet, it was more than enough for a student. In fact, I couldn't even use half the interest from it. This financial comfort led me into an unforeseen situation. Chapter 10. Being financially comfortable, I thought about moving out of my noisy lodging and setting up my own place. However, buying household items seemed troublesome. I would need an honest housekeeper, and I had to be sure the house would be safe when I was away. It didn't seem easy to execute. One day, I decided to look for a house and went for a walk, heading west down Hongo-dai and up the Koishikawa slope toward Denzuin. The area has changed completely since the streetcar route was introduced. At that time, the left side was the earthen wall of the artillery factory, and the right side was an open field with grass growing all over. I stood in the grass, absent-mindedly looking at the cliff. The scenery was not bad even now, but back then the western side had a different charm. The greenery as far as the eye could see was calming. I wondered if there was a suitable house around there. So, I crossed the field and headed north along a narrow street. The houses in that area were quite dirty. I walked around, turning corners and passing through alleys. Eventually, I asked a candy shop lady if there were any small rental houses around. She thought for a while and then said, "I don't think so." I was about to give up when she asked, "How about a private boarding house?" I changed my mind, thinking it would be nice to stay in a quiet private house without the hassle of owning one. I sat in the candy shop and got more details from her. It was the house of a military family, or rather, the widow of a soldier. The candy shop lady said the husband died during the Sino-Japanese War. About a year ago, they lived near the military academy in Ichigaya, but sold that large house and moved here. They had asked the candy shop lady to help find someone to board because it was lonely living alone. I confirmed that only the widow, her daughter, and a maid lived there. I thought it would be quiet and pleasant. However, I worried that they might reject a student like me with no proper introduction. I considered giving up, but then thought my appearance wasn't too shabby, and I was wearing my university cap. You might laugh, but back then, university students were highly respected. I found confidence in my square cap and visited the house, as the candy shop lady suggested, without an introduction. I met the widow and explained my purpose. She asked about my background, school, and major. Feeling satisfied, she immediately said I could move in any time. She was a straightforward and respectable woman. I wondered if all military wives were like that. I was impressed and puzzled by her openness, wondering why she felt lonely with such a strong character. Chapter 11. I promptly moved into that house. I rented the parlor where I first talked with the widow. It was the best room in the house. Back then, boarding houses around Hongo were being built here and there, and I knew the best rooms available to students. My new room was far superior. Initially, it seemed too luxurious for a student like me. The room was 8 tatami mats in size, with a tokonoma alcove and a closet. There were no windows, but the bright sunlight streamed in from the south-facing veranda. On the day I moved in, I noticed a flower arrangement and a koto in the room. I didn't like either. Growing up with a father who appreciated poetry, calligraphy, and tea ceremonies, I had developed a taste for traditional arts and had come to despise such gaudy decorations. My father's collection of artifacts had been mostly squandered by my uncle, but some remained. I had left some with an old friend and brought a few interesting pieces with me. I intended to enjoy them by displaying them in the alcove. However, seeing the koto and flowers, I lost the courage. Later, I learned that the flowers were a welcoming gesture for me, and I smiled wryly. The koto had been there from the beginning and was probably left there due to a lack of space. Such a story might make you imagine a young woman. Indeed, even before moving in, I was curious. Perhaps this curiosity spoiled my natural demeanor, or maybe I was still not used to people. But when I first met the daughter, I greeted her awkwardly. She blushed as well. I had imagined the daughter's appearance and personality based on the widow's. However, my assumptions were not favorable to her. I thought that since the widow was a military wife, her daughter must be similar. But the moment I saw her, all my assumptions vanished, and a new sense of femininity I hadn't imagined entered my mind. Suddenly, I didn't mind the flowers in the alcove or the koto leaning against the wall. The flowers were regularly replaced, and the koto was often moved to another room. I would rest my chin on my hand and listen to the koto's sound. I couldn't tell if it was good or bad, but it didn't seem very skillful. It was probably on par with the flower arrangements. The daughter was definitely not good at arranging flowers. Even so, various flowers continued to decorate my alcove, and the koto played softly in the background. I enjoyed the sight of the flowers and listened to the koto's mediocre music. Chapter 12. When I left my hometown, I was already feeling disillusioned. The belief that I couldn't rely on others seemed to have seeped into my bones. I saw my uncle and other relatives, whom I resented, as representatives of humanity. Even on the train, I observed the people around me warily, and if someone spoke to me, I became even more cautious. My mind was gloomy, and at times I felt as if I had swallowed lead. My nerves were sharp. My decision to move out of my boarding house in Tokyo was influenced by this. If I hadn't had the financial means, I wouldn't have considered setting up my own place. But even with the means, my usual self would have avoided such trouble. After moving to Koishikawa, I couldn't relax. I felt ashamed of myself for constantly watching my surroundings. My head and eyes were active, but my mouth was increasingly silent. I sat quietly, observing the household like a cat. I felt guilty for being so vigilant. You might find it strange that I could still hold affection for the daughter. How could I enjoy her poor flower arrangements and mediocre koto playing? When asked, I can only say that both were true. I doubted humanity regarding money, but not regarding love. That's why such contradictions coexisted within me. I always called the widow Madam, so I'll continue to do so. Madam praised me as a quiet, studious man. She never mentioned my nervous looks or skittish behavior. Whether she noticed them or not, I couldn't tell, but she seemed to pay no attention. She once complimented me for being generous, which made me blush and deny her words. She seriously explained that I wasn't aware of it myself. Madam hadn't planned to take in a student like me. She intended to rent the room to a government employee or someone similar. That's why she found me generous compared to her original expectations. Perhaps I was generous compared to someone living a frugal life, but it wasn't a matter of temperament, so it hardly affected my inner life. Chapter 13. Madam's attitude influenced my feelings. Over time, I became less nervous and felt more at ease. The family's indifference to my suspicious and wary behavior brought me great comfort. My nerves calmed without the reflection of suspicion. Madam might have intentionally treated me this way, or truly observed me as generous. Perhaps my paranoia was more in my mind and didn't show outwardly, or maybe Madam was deceived. As I became calmer, I grew closer to the family, engaging in conversations and tea gatherings. Sometimes I invited them to my room with sweets. I felt my social circle had suddenly expanded, often at the expense of my study time. Strangely, this interruption didn't bother me. Madam was naturally free, and though the daughter was busy with school, flowers, and koto, she seemed to have plenty of time. The three of us would often gather to chat and play. The daughter usually came to fetch me, sometimes standing at my veranda or peeking from the next room. She would call my name and ask, "Are you studying?" Most of the time, I was at my desk with a difficult book open, appearing studious. In reality, I was waiting for her call. If she didn't come, I would get up and go to the next room, asking, "Are you studying?" The daughter's room was adjacent to the living room, often shared with Madame. My calls were usually answered by Madame, with the daughter rarely responding. Sometimes the daughter would visit my room, sitting and talking. In such moments, I felt strangely uneasy. It wasn't just the discomfort of sitting alone with a young woman. I felt restless, like I was betraying myself. The daughter, however, was quite comfortable, unlike her shy demeanor when playing the koto. She would stay even when called by her mother, only responding, "Yes," but not leaving immediately. Chapter 14. I often sighed with relief after the daughter left, feeling both unfulfilled and guilty. Perhaps I was somewhat effeminate. You might see it that way now, but back then we were all somewhat like that. Madame rarely went out, and even when she did, she never left the daughter and me alone. Whether by chance or intention, I couldn't tell. Observing Madame, I sometimes felt she wanted to bring the daughter and me closer. Yet at other times, she seemed to subtly warn me away. This contradictory behavior occasionally troubled me. I wished Madame would be more consistent. My reasoning saw it as a clear contradiction. Still hurt by my uncle's betrayal, I couldn't help but suspect that one of Madame's attitudes was genuine and the other false. I doubted, confused, and couldn't grasp her true intentions. I sometimes attributed it to her being a woman, seeing it as a foolish trait. Despite my low opinion of women, I couldn't underestimate the daughter. My reasoning didn't work with her. I held a nearly religious love for her. You might find it strange, but I firmly believe that true love is not much different from religious devotion. Seeing her face made me feel purified, and thinking of her filled me with noble sentiments. If love has two poles, one divine and the other carnal, my love captured the higher one. Though I was human and bound to the flesh, my thoughts and feelings towards her were entirely pure. My relationship with Madame and the daughter became more complicated as my love for the daughter deepened. Initially, this change was internal and not outwardly visible. Eventually, I began to suspect that I had misunderstood Madame. I realized that both her attitudes towards me were genuine and coexisted within her. She wanted to bring the daughter and me closer while also warning me away, balancing these conflicting intentions. Since I had no carnal desire towards the daughter, I saw Madame's concern as unnecessary and stopped thinking ill of her. Chapter 15. By combining my observations of Madame, I confirmed that I was fully trusted in this household. I even found evidence that this trust existed from our first meeting. For someone who had started to distrust others, this realization was oddly striking. I thought women had more intuitive senses than men, and that's why they could be deceived by men. It's funny to think that while observing Madame this way, I was also intuitively trusting the daughter. Despite my vow not to trust others, I trusted the daughter completely. Yet, I found it strange that Madame trusted me. I didn't talk much about my hometown, especially about recent events. I felt a certain discomfort even thinking about them. I tried to listen to Madame's stories instead, but she insisted on knowing about my hometown. Eventually, I told her everything. I told her I would never return home, as there was nothing left for me except my parents' graves. Madame seemed deeply moved, and the daughter cried. I felt good about sharing my story and was pleased. Having heard everything, Madame seemed to feel validated in her initial intuition. She began to treat me like a young relative. I didn't mind. I even felt happy. However, my suspicions soon resurfaced. It started with something trivial, but grew over time. I began to wonder if Madame, like my uncle, was trying to get me closer to the daughter for some ulterior motive. The thought that what seemed like kindness might actually be cunning strategy gnawed at me. Madame had always said she wanted boarders because it was lonely. I believed her. Even after hearing her confessions, I didn't doubt her. However, the household wasn't exceptionally wealthy. From an economic standpoint, it wouldn't be a loss for them to form a special relationship with me. I became cautious again, but loving the daughter so strongly, what could my caution achieve? I mocked myself, calling myself foolish. Yet my torment arose from the suspicion that the daughter might also be part of a scheme. If I imagined that both mother and daughter were conspiring behind my back, I became overwhelmingly distressed. It wasn't just unpleasant, it felt like a dead end. Despite this, I couldn't stop believing in the daughter. Torn between faith and doubt, I couldn't move. Both scenarios seemed plausible and true to me. Chapter 16. I continued attending school, but the lectures felt distant. My studies followed suit. The words I read faded away like smoke before reaching my mind. I became increasingly silent. Some friends misunderstood, thinking I was absorbed in deep thought. I didn't correct them, finding comfort in their mistaken perception. Occasionally, though, I would act out impulsively, surprising them. My lodging had few visitors and relatives. The daughter's school friends sometimes visited, but spoke so quietly it was hard to tell they were there. I didn't realize it was out of consideration for me. My guests, though not particularly rowdy, never felt the need to be overly considerate of the household. In a way, as a lodger, I felt like the master, with the daughter as the guest. This detail might be trivial, but there was something significant. Suddenly, a man's voice would be heard from the living room or the daughter's room. Unlike my visitors, this voice was low and hard to understand, which agitated my nerves. Sitting there, I grew restless, wondering who it could be. Family, acquaintance, young or old. I couldn't know from my seat, nor could I get up and peek through the door. The uncertainty caused waves of distress. After the visitor left, I would always ask who it was. Madame or the daughter would give brief answers, leaving me unsatisfied, yet lacking the courage to pry further. I felt a mixture of dignity and longing, showing both in my face. They would laugh, perhaps out of kindness, but I couldn't tell. I would brood over whether they were mocking me. I was free to leave school or pursue any path without consulting anyone. I often thought of proposing to the daughter, but each time I hesitated and remained silent. It wasn't fear of rejection, but a reluctance to be manipulated. Betrayed by my uncle, I resolved never to be deceived again. Chapter 17. Seeing me buy only books, Madame suggested I get some proper clothes. All I had were simple cotton garments. Back then, students didn't wear silk. I had a friend from a wealthy family in Yokohama who once received a silk undershirt. Everyone laughed at him, and he never wore it, even when urged to do so. Eventually, lice infested the shirt, and he threw it into a ditch. I watched, laughing without feeling any pity. By then, I had grown, but not enough to care about clothes. I believed that only graduates needed to worry about their attire. So I told Madame I needed books, not clothes. Madame knew how many books I bought and asked if I read them all. Some were untouched, and I struggled to reply. Realizing my folly, I decided to buy something the daughter might like, using the excuse of needing clothes. Madame insisted I accompany her along with the daughter. Unlike today, students didn't usually go out with young women. Still a slave to habit, I hesitated, but eventually agreed. The daughter dressed up beautifully, her fair complexion accentuated by powder. People stared at her and then at me, making me uncomfortable. We went to Nihonbashi and bought what we needed, taking longer than expected due to constant changes of mind. Madame often asked my opinion, even holding fabrics against the daughter and asking me to judge. I gave my opinions readily. We finished around dinner time, and Madame, wanting to thank me, took me to a small restaurant in a narrow alley with a Yos vaudeville theater. I was surprised by her knowledge of the area. We returned home at night. The next day was Sunday, so I stayed in my room. On Monday, a classmate teased me, asking when I got married and complimenting my beautiful wife. He must have seen us at Nihonbashi. Chapter 18. I told Madame and the daughter about this. Madame laughed, but looked at me, saying it must have been annoying. At that moment, I thought about how men attract attention from women. Madame's gaze confirmed my thoughts. Perhaps I should have confessed my feelings then, but doubt held me back. I avoided addressing myself directly and instead inquired about the daughter's marriage prospects. Madame mentioned a few proposals, but explained they weren't in a hurry due to her youth and school. She seemed proud of the daughter's looks, suggesting she could marry well at any time. I sensed she was reluctant to let her go, perhaps torn between marrying her off or taking in a son-in-law. I felt I learned much from Madame, but the conversation ended without me confessing my feelings. I stood up to leave, seeing the daughter, who had laughed earlier, now sitting in the corner with her back to me. I noticed she was examining something on her lap, taken from the cupboard. I recognized it as the fabric we bought, stored with our other purchases. As I was about to leave, Madame abruptly asked for my opinion on whether it was better to wait or not for the daughter's marriage. I suggested taking it slow, and Madame agreed. Another man soon joined our household, significantly altering my fate. If not for his intrusion, I wouldn't have needed to write this long letter. Ironically, I was the one who brought him here, though with Madame's consent. Despite her objections, I insisted on my decision. Chapter 19. I'll call this friend K. We had been friends since childhood, sharing the same hometown. K was the son of a Jodo Shinshu Buddhist priest, though not the eldest son. He was adopted by a doctor. In our region, Shinshu temples were wealthy, and K's family was no exception. K was sent to Tokyo for studies due to the adoption. K's adoptive family was also wealthy, providing him with funds for his education. Although we didn't come to Tokyo together, we soon shared a lodging. We shared a room, feeling like animals in a cage, fearful of Tokyo yet boasting grandly within our 6 tatami mat room. We were serious, intending to achieve greatness. K particularly was determined. Raised in a temple, he often spoke of devotion. His actions seemed driven by this concept. I always admired him. In middle school, K troubled me with complex topics like religion and philosophy, likely influenced by his father or the temple's atmosphere. K's adoptive family intended for him to become a doctor, but he was determined not to. I questioned his decision, but he boldly answered that he didn't care about deceiving his adoptive parents, as long as it was for his path. Though young, I found his conviction noble and supported him. 20K and I entered the same university program. K, with a calm demeanor, pursued his chosen path with his adoptive family's funds, feeling both secure and daring. He was more at ease than I was. During the first summer break, K didn't return home. He rented a room in a temple in Komagome to study. When I returned in early September, I found him living in a small room near the temple's main hall, seemingly content with his arrangement. He wore prayer beads around his wrist, which he counted several times a day, though I didn't understand the significance. It's a trivial matter, but I often wonder about it. I also saw a Bible in his room, which surprised me, as I had only heard him mention Buddhist sutras before. When I asked why, he simply said it was natural to read such a revered book. He intended to read the Quran as well, fascinated by Muhammad and the sword. The following summer, Kay was pressured to return home and finally did. He didn't mention his change of study plans, and his family seemed unaware. As a student, you probably understand how little the outside world knows about our academic life. Kay, understanding this better than I did, returned with a calm demeanor. On the train, I asked about his visit, and he nonchalantly replied that it was fine. The third summer was when I decided to leave my hometown for good. I urged Kay to return home, but he refused, preferring to stay and study. I left Tokyo alone, enduring a turbulent 2 months in my hometown, as previously described. Returning in September, I found that Kay's circumstances had also changed. He had confessed everything to his adoptive family, admitting his deception. He had resolved from the start not to continue deceiving them, and had decided to follow his chosen path, regardless of the consequences. Chapter 21. Kay's adoptive father was furious when he received Kay's letter. He sent a strict reply, stating that he could not continue to fund someone who deceived his parents. Kay showed me this letter, as well as another harsh letter he received from his birth family around the same time. It was clear they felt obligated to the adoptive family, and wrote that they no longer cared about Kay. The immediate concern was how to cover the monthly school expenses. I asked Kay if he had any plans. He said he intended to work as a night school teacher. During those times, it was not as difficult to find such part-time jobs as one might think. I believed Kay could manage with that. However, I felt responsible for encouraging him to follow his own path against his adoptive family's wishes. I couldn't just stand by. I offered him financial help, but he refused it outright. Kay preferred self-reliance over depending on a friend's charity, and he believed that if he couldn't support himself, he wasn't fit to be a man. I didn't want to hurt his pride, so I let him do as he wished. Kay soon found a job. It must have been tough for him, but he continued to study diligently while shouldering this new burden. I worried about his health, but he brushed off my concerns. His relationship with his adoptive family grew more strained. With less time to talk, I didn't get the full story, but I knew things were becoming more complicated. Someone tried to mediate, but Kay refused to return home, further angering his adoptive family. My efforts to reconcile both sides were in vain. My letters were ignored, and I grew angry. Previously sympathetic to Kay, I now supported him unconditionally, regardless of right or wrong. Finally, Kay was officially disowned by his adoptive family. His birth family agreed to repay the funds they had provided, and Kay was left to his own devices. Effectively disowned, he felt it was as though he had been disowned. Kay had no mother, and I wondered if his strained relationship with his family might have been different if she had been alive. His father, though a monk, seemed to have the sense of duty more akin to a samurai. Chapter 22. After Kei's disownment was settled, I received a long letter from Kei's sister's husband. Kei's adoptive family was a relative of this man, and his opinions had been influential during both Kei's adoption and disownment. The letter asked for news of Kei, as his sister was worried. Kei liked this sister more than his brother, who had inherited the temple. Despite being full siblings, there was a significant age gap, and she had been more of a mother to him than their stepmother. I showed the letter to Kei. He admitted receiving similar letters from his sister, to which he had reassured her not to worry. Despite her sympathy, her financial situation prevented her from helping him materially. I replied to the brother-in-law, assuring him that I would take care of Kei if necessary. This was partly out of kindness, but also a way to assert myself to Kei's family, who seemed to disregard me. Kei had supported himself for about a year and a half since his disownment. However, this effort took a toll on his health and spirit. The stress of his disownment likely contributed to this. He became increasingly sentimental, sometimes speaking as if he bore the world's burdens alone. His impatience grew as his prospects seemed to fade. His anxiety was far more intense than usual, and I focused on calming him down. I urged Kei to stop overworking himself, suggesting he relax and enjoy life for his future benefit. As expected, Kei resisted, arguing that his goal was not just academic success, but strengthening his will through adversity. To him, living in hardship was essential for developing strength. This might seem irrational, but Kei believed in the value of enduring hardship. Despite recognizing his strong will, I worried that he was close to a breakdown. I proposed we live together and strive to improve ourselves together, even kneeling before him to persuade him. Eventually, I managed to bring him to live with me. Chapter 23. My room had a 4-mat tatami room attached, which was inconvenient as it had to be crossed to reach my main room. I put Kei there, although he initially preferred sharing my larger room. As mentioned before, Madame opposed this arrangement at first. She argued that having more people was not beneficial since it wasn't a business. When I reassured her that Kei wouldn't be troublesome, she said it wasn't about trouble, but preferring known company. When I pointed out that I was also an unknown person at first, she insisted she knew me well from the beginning. I smiled wryly, and she shifted her argument, saying it was for my sake. When I asked how it could harm me, she just smiled. In truth, I didn't need Kei to live with me. However, knowing his strong sense of independence, I feared he would hesitate to accept financial help directly. I planned to provide for him discreetly by giving extra money to Madame without telling Kei. However, I didn't want to reveal Kei's financial struggles to her. I explained Kei's need for support due to his strained relationships with both his adoptive and birth families. I asked Madame and her daughter to care for Kei warmly, as if saving a drowning man. Finally, Madame relented, though Kei was unaware of these discussions. I welcomed him as if nothing had happened. Madame and her daughter kindly helped him settle in. They interpreted their kindness as a favor to me, which pleased me despite Kei's usual reticence. When I asked Kei how he felt about his new living arrangement, he only said it wasn't bad. In truth, his previous room was damp and poorly lit with poor food. Moving to my house was like moving from a valley to a hilltop, but his ascetic beliefs made him downplay any comfort. Influenced by Buddhist teachings, he saw luxury as immoral, feeling that punishing the body enhanced the spirit. I avoided contradicting him, hoping he would gradually soften and adapt. I believed that eventually he would recognize the benefits of his new environment. Chapter 24. Madame's treatment had gradually made me more cheerful, so I tried to apply the same approach to Kay. Despite our different personalities, I hoped the household environment would eventually have a calming effect on him. Kay had stronger willpower and studied more than I did. He was naturally more intelligent and often ranked higher in school. I always felt inferior, but when I persuaded Kay to live with me, I believed I understood things better than he did. I felt he didn't grasp the distinction between endurance and patience. I wanted to clarify this for him, but knowing he would likely react strongly, I refrained from raising the issue. Kay's intense dedication made him formidable, even if it meant self-destruction. Knowing his temperament and suspecting he had a touch of neurasthenia, I avoided provoking him. Despite my fear of isolation, I couldn't bear to see my friends suffer the same loneliness I had. I chose to observe quietly, hoping the household's influence would gradually help him. Chapter 25. I asked Madame and her daughter to engage with Kay as much as possible, believing his isolation was harming him. Madame laughed at his reticence, and her daughter gave examples of his aloof behavior. He often refused help, even if it was cold and he needed a fire. I found it understandable, but sought to improve his social interaction. I tried to facilitate conversations between Kay and the family, sometimes calling them over while Kay and I talked or bringing Kay into their discussions. Kay wasn't keen on this and sometimes left the room or refused to join. He seemed to disdain such interactions, which he found trivial, but I realized he might look down on me for participating. Recognizing Kay's high standards, I still believed that making him more socially integrated was crucial. Despite his intellectual pursuits, he needed to connect with people. To humanize him, I exposed him to feminine company, believing this would soften his hardened disposition. This strategy gradually succeeded, as he began to see women in a more positive light, realizing their value beyond his initial judgments. Seeing Kay's change was gratifying, and I shared my thoughts with Madame and her daughter, who were also pleased with the progress. Chapter 26. Kay and I, despite being in the same program, had different schedules due to our specializations. If I returned earlier, I would pass through his empty room. If later, we would exchange brief greetings. Kay would usually ask if I had just returned, to which I sometimes nodded or gave a brief affirmative response. One day, returning later than usual from Kanda, I heard the daughter's voice from Kay's room as I entered the house. The house layout made it clear where the voices were coming from. I closed the door and the voices stopped. As I took off my shoes, I wondered if I had imagined it. When I opened the sliding door, I found Kay and the daughter sitting together. They greeted me, but their tone seemed somewhat unnatural, as if caught off guard. I asked about Madame, who was out, leaving Kay and the daughter alone in the house, a rare occurrence. Madame and the maid soon returned, and we gathered for dinner. The maid had not come at the usual time, prompting Madame to go to town for provisions. The daughter laughed during the explanation, but Madame quickly reprimanded her. Chapter 27. A week later, I passed by Kay's room again and found him talking with the daughter. She laughed upon seeing me, but I didn't ask why. At dinner, she called me strange, but I didn't inquire further, noticing Madame's stern look towards her. After dinner, I took Kay for a walk, hoping to understand his views on Madame and her daughter. However, Kay's responses were vague and indifferent. His focus seemed to be on his studies rather than the household dynamics. His academic dedication was admirable, but I felt he was missing something essential about human connections. When we finished our exams, Madame was pleased, anticipating both our graduations and the daughter's. Kay dismissed the significance of her studies, overlooking her other skills. I laughed at his narrow view, reiterating that women's value wasn't solely in academics. He didn't argue, but his demeanor suggested he still undervalued the daughter. My jealousy towards Kay was already growing. I suggested a summer trip, but Kay was reluctant, preferring to stay and study. When I insisted on the benefits of a break, he suggested I go alone. I didn't want to leave Kay alone with the family, fearing their growing closeness. Madame intervened, and we finally agreed to go to Boso together. Chapter 28K was not fond of travel, and neither of us had been to Boso. We disembarked at a fishing village, but the smell and rough sea soon made us move to other locations. We eventually settled in a student-friendly seaside area, often sitting on the rocks, watching the sea and the fish below. Kay, however, seemed more absorbed in his thoughts than the scenery. I often wondered if Kay shared my feelings for the daughter, but he showed no signs. I considered confessing my feelings to Kay, but hesitated, fearing his high-mindedness. I felt trapped between admiration and jealousy, unable to find the right moment to speak. 29, I had intended to confide in Kay about my feelings for the daughter even before the trip, but the opportunity never seemed right. Conversations about women were rare and usually abstract. Despite our closeness, I struggled to break the ice on this topic, feeling frustrated by Kay's detached demeanor. At times, I felt reassured by Kay's aloofness, but my doubts always resurfaced, fueled by my insecurities. Kay's apparent superiority in many aspects exacerbated my anxiety. During our trip, Kay suggested returning to Tokyo, but I resisted, not wanting to leave him alone with the family. We traveled through Boso, enduring the heat and exhaustion. This physical strain seemed to alter our usual dynamic, making our interactions more straightforward and less intellectually intense. In one memorable instance, we visited a temple, and Kay engaged deeply with the monks about Nichiren. Despite my disinterest, Kay's fervor was evident. This incident highlighted our differing priorities and Kay's enduring spiritual quest. Later, Kay criticized my lack of spiritual ambition, which struck a nerve given my feelings for the daughter. This tension added another layer to our complex relationship. Chapter 30. Walking like this in the heat and fatigue naturally throws off the body's rhythm. It's not quite an illness, but it feels as if my soul has suddenly moved into someone else's body. I spoke with Kay as usual, but there was a sense of detachment from my usual feelings. The closeness and resentment I felt toward him took on a peculiar nature specific to our journey. Because of the heat, the tides, and the walking, we entered a new relationship different from before. We felt like traveling salesmen who had become temporary companions. No matter how much we talked, we never touched on complex or intellectual subjects as we usually would. In this manner, we eventually made it to Choshi, but I can't forget a single exception along the way. Before leaving the Boso Peninsula, we visited Tai-no-Ura in Kominato. It's been many years, and I wasn't particularly interested, so my memory is hazy. But the place was said to be the birthplace of Nichiren. There's a legend that 2 sea bream were washed ashore on the day Nichiren was born. Since then, the fishermen in the village have refrained from catching sea-bream, resulting in an abundance of them in the bay. We hired a small boat to see the sea-bream. At that time, I was solely focused on watching the waves. I observed the slightly purplish sea-bream moving in the waves as an amusing phenomenon. However, Kei didn't seem to share my interest. Instead of the sea-bream, he seemed more preoccupied with thoughts of Nichiren. There was a temple called Tanjoji there, named presumably because it was Nichiren's birthplace. It was an impressive temple. Kei suggested we go and meet the head priest. To be honest, we were dressed rather oddly. Kei's hat had been blown into the sea by the wind, so he bought a sedge hat. Our clothes were dirty and sweaty. I suggested we avoid meeting the priest. But Kei, being stubborn, didn't listen. He said I could wait outside if I didn't want to go. Having no other choice, I accompanied him to the temple gate, thinking we'd surely be turned away. Surprisingly, the priest was very polite, inviting us into a spacious and impressive room. At that time, I didn't share Kei's enthusiasm for talking to the priest. Kei was very eager to ask about Nichiren. The priest mentioned that Nichiren was known for his excellent cursive script, called Sosho Nichiren. Kei, who wasn't skilled in calligraphy, made a face as if to say, "What nonsense." Kei was more interested in the deeper meaning of Nichiren's teachings. Whether the priest was able to satisfy Kei's curiosity is doubtful, but after leaving the temple grounds, Kei passionately discussed Nichiren with me. I was too tired and weary to pay attention and responded half-heartedly. Eventually, I stopped responding altogether. The following night, after arriving at our lodging and eating dinner, we were about to go to bed when we suddenly began a serious debate. Kei was unhappy that I had not engaged with him about Nichiren the previous day. He criticized me, saying that those without spiritual ambition are fools, making me feel as if I were shallow. However, I had my own concerns about the young lady, and I couldn't simply laugh off his words. I began to defend myself. Chapter 31. At that time, I frequently used the phrase "to be human." Kei said that I was using this phrase to hide all my weaknesses. In retrospect, he was right. However, since I had started using that phrase to make Kei understand my point of view, my approach was inherently confrontational, and I didn't have the luxury to reflect on it. I continued to assert my argument. Then Kei asked me which part of him I thought was inhuman. I told him, "You are human, or perhaps too human, but you say things that are inhuman and try to act in an inhuman way." When I said this, Kei only responded that perhaps others saw him that way because his self-cultivation was lacking, and he didn't try to refute me. Instead of feeling relieved, I felt sorry for him. I ended the discussion there. His mood gradually became somber. He said that if I understood the ancients as he did, I wouldn't attack him in such a manner, expressing his sorrow. The ancients Kei referred to were neither heroes nor strongmen, but those who practiced severe asceticism, tormenting their bodies for the sake of their spirits or their principles. Kei explicitly stated how regretful he felt that I couldn't understand how much he was suffering for this cause. Kei and I went to sleep after that. The next day we returned to our usual routine, sweating and trudging along. However, I kept recalling the previous night's conversation. I regretted missing such an opportune moment by pretending not to understand, wondering why I hadn't spoken more directly to Kei. Instead of using abstract terms like "to be human," I should have revealed my feelings about the young lady directly. Since my feelings for her underpinned the theory I had crafted, presenting the raw truth to Kay would have been more beneficial. But I lacked the courage to break through the inertia of our academic relationship. Whether it was vanity or affectation, the result was the same. My version of vanity differed from the usual, and if you understand this, I will be, say, satisfied. We returned to Tokyo looking tanned and thin. By the time we returned, I no longer cared about the theoretical distinctions of human or inhuman. Kay also showed no signs of a religious demeanor. Probably the spiritual concerns he usually harbored were absent. We looked like foreigners, marveling at the busy city. Then we went to Ryogoku and ate chicken hot pot despite the heat. Kay suggested walking all the way back to Koishikawa, and since I was physically stronger than him, I agreed. When we arrived home, Madame was surprised at how tanned and thin we had become. Despite our appearance, she praised us for looking healthy. Her daughter laughed at the contradiction, and for once I found it amusing instead of irritating. Perhaps the circumstances and the long absence made her laughter more enjoyable. Chapter 32. Moreover, I noticed a change in the daughter's attitude. Returning from our trip, we needed Madame's help to settle back in, but I noticed that the daughter now seemed to prioritize me over Kay. Her attentiveness was subtle, directed at me in a way only I could notice without making Kay feel left out. This made me secretly grateful to her. Summer ended, and by mid-September we resumed our school routines. With our different schedules, I often returned later than Kay, about 3 times a week. However, I never saw the daughter in Kay's room during these times. Kay would greet me with his usual, "Have you just come back?" and I would respond mechanically. Around mid-October, I overslept one morning and rushed to school in my Japanese clothes, without taking the time to tie my lace-up shoes, opting for sandals instead. I was supposed to return home earlier than Kay that day. When I arrived, I heard Kay's voice and the daughter's laughter from Kay's room. I hurriedly entered and found Kay at his desk, but the daughter had just left. Kay said he wasn't feeling well and had taken the day off. Shortly after, the daughter brought me tea and greeted me for the first time that day. I wasn't bold enough to ask why she had left Kay's room in such a hurry, but the thought lingered in my mind. The daughter then exchanged a few words with Kay at the door, continuing a conversation I hadn't heard the start of. The daughter's behavior became increasingly relaxed. Even when Kay and I were both home, she would often call out to Kay from the veranda and then sit with him. While these interactions were normal, I couldn't help feeling that she was giving Kay more attention than me. At times, it even seemed like she was deliberately avoiding my room to spend time with Kay. You might wonder why I didn't ask Kay to leave. However, doing so would undermine the reason I had brought him into the house in the first place. I couldn't bring myself to do it. Chapter 33. It was a cold, rainy day in November. I returned home through Konyaku-enma, soaking my overcoat in the process. Kay's room was empty, but his brazier was warm with freshly added charcoal. I hurriedly opened the door to my room, eager to warm my cold hands, only to find my brazier filled with cold, white ashes. I felt a sudden surge of irritation. Madame, hearing my footsteps, came out and kindly helped me change into dry clothes. Seeing that I was cold, she brought Kay's brazier to my room. When I asked if Kay had already returned, she replied that he had come home and then gone out again. Given the timing, this puzzled me, but Madame speculated he must have had some errand. I sat there reading for a while, but the house felt cold and lonely, intensifying the early winter chill. I soon felt an urge to go somewhere more lively. The rain had stopped, but the sky remained heavy and gray. I grabbed my umbrella and headed east along the back wall of the artillery arsenal. The streets were muddy, especially as I descended the hill towards Yanagicho, making it difficult to walk. In the middle of the narrow, muddy path, I suddenly encountered Kei. Focused on my footing, I didn't notice him until we almost collided. I asked where he had been, but he only said, "Just nearby," in his usual curt manner. As we passed each other, I saw a young woman standing behind him. It was the daughter, and I was taken aback. She greeted me with a slightly flushed face, and I stood there, momentarily stunned, before stepping into the mud to let her pass. After leaving Yanagicho, I wandered aimlessly, feeling disoriented and dissatisfied. Eventually, I returned home, still troubled by the encounter. Chapter 34. I asked Kei if he had been out with the daughter. He said no, explaining that they had met by chance in Masagocho and walked back together. I refrained from asking further questions. During dinner, I was tempted to ask the daughter the same question. However, she responded with her usual teasing laughter, telling me to guess where she had been. This irritated me, but it seemed only Madame noticed. Kei remained indifferent. The daughter's behavior was ambiguous, and it was hard to tell if she was being playful or genuinely naive. While she was generally thoughtful, she also exhibited traits I found annoying, which only became evident after Kei moved in. I couldn't decide whether my irritation stemmed from jealousy towards Kei or from her behavior. Even now, I cannot entirely dismiss my jealousy, recognizing it as an aspect of my love. Love and jealousy seemed intertwined, especially since even trivial matters would provoke my jealousy. This kind of jealousy might indeed be half of love. I contemplated confessing my feelings to the daughter directly. However, it wasn't her I intended to approach, but Madame, asking for her daughter's hand in marriage. Despite resolving to do this, I kept postponing the confrontation day by day. It wasn't indecision that held me back, it was my fear that the daughter might have feelings for Kei. If she did, my love would be pointless, as I didn't want to be with someone who loved another. I was too principled to pursue a relationship under such circumstances, unlike those who might forcefully marry their beloved, regardless of their true feelings. My love was a blend of idealism and practicality. Despite having opportunities to speak to the daughter directly, I avoided them, adhering to Japanese customs that discouraged such direct approaches. Additionally, I doubted the daughter would openly express her feelings, bound by societal expectations. Chapter 35. Thus, I remained indecisive, paralyzed by my emotions. It felt like being half awake, unable to move despite being fully aware of my surroundings. Winter turned to spring, and one day Madame suggested that Kei invite a friend for a game of Karuta. Kei immediately replied that he had no friends, which surprised her. Indeed, Kei had no close friends. He had acquaintances, but none suitable for a game of Karuta. Madame then suggested inviting one of my friends, but I was not in the mood for such a lively activity and gave a vague response. Eventually, Kei and I were coerced into playing by the daughter. It was a quiet game since there were no guests, and Kei, unfamiliar with the game, was almost a passive participant. I asked if he knew the poems in Hyakunin Isshu, and he admitted he didn't. The daughter seemed to take this as a slight and started helping Kei conspicuously. It reached a point where they teamed up against me, though Kei's demeanor remained unchanged. Seeing his lack of arrogance, I managed to get through the game without conflict. A few days later, Madam and the daughter went to visit relatives in Ichigaya. Kay and I, with school not yet started, stayed home like caretakers. I wasn't in the mood for reading or going for a walk, so I sat idly by the brazier, lost in thought. Kay was equally silent in the next room. This wasn't unusual for us, so I paid it little mind. Around 10 a.m., Kay suddenly opened the sliding door and asked what I was thinking about. I wasn't thinking about anything specific, probably the daughter. The daughter, along with Madam and recently Kay, occupied my thoughts, complicating matters. Facing Kay, I couldn't admit seeing him as an obstacle, so I remained silent. Kay then entered my room and sat by the brazier. I moved slightly to make room for him. Kay began asking about Madam and the daughter's visit, which puzzled me. His interest was out of character, given his usual disinterest in such matters. Eventually, I asked why he was so curious, for which he fell silent, his lips trembling. Kay was naturally reserved and often hesitated before speaking, giving weight to his words. When he finally confessed his love for the daughter, I was stunned, feeling as though I had turned to stone. My immediate reaction was one of intense shock and disbelief. That moment I felt a mixture of fear and suffering, my body rigid with tension. I quickly realized I had missed my chance and felt a deep sense of failure. However, I didn't know what to do next, paralyzed by the intensity of my emotions. Kay continued to reveal his feelings, oblivious to my turmoil. His confession was heavy and sincere, making me feel increasingly uneasy. His presence felt overpowering, adding to my distress. After Kay finished speaking, I was unable to respond. My mind was too overwhelmed to decide whether to confess my feelings or keep silent. We had lunch in silence, with both of us lost in our thoughts. Chapter 36. Kay wouldn't stop talking about the wife and the daughter. Eventually, he began asking such intimate questions that I couldn't even answer. Rather than feeling annoyed, I was struck by a sense of wonder. When I remembered how he had reacted when I brought up the two of them before, I couldn't help but notice how different his demeanor was now. I finally asked him why he was talking about such things today. At that moment, he suddenly fell silent. However, I observed the way the muscles around his tightly closed mouth were trembling. Kay was originally a taciturn man. Whenever he wanted to say something, he had a habit of moving his mouth around before speaking. It was perhaps because his lips did not easily part to reveal his intentions that his words carried such weight. When he finally spoke, his words had twice the power of an ordinary person's. When I glanced at his mouth, I immediately sensed that something was about to come out, but I had no idea what he was preparing to say. That's why I was so surprised. Imagine how I felt when his solemn lips confessed his poignant love for the daughter. I felt as if I had been turned to stone by his magic wand. I couldn't even manage to move my lips. In that moment, I was a bundle of fear and suffering, a single, solid lump. From head to toe, I had become as stiff as stone or iron. I was so rigid that I lost even the flexibility needed to breathe. Fortunately, this state did not last long. After a moment, I regained my human feelings. Then I immediately felt that I had made a mistake. I realized I had been overtaken. However, I had no idea what to do next. I probably didn't have the mental capacity to think about it. I sat there, enduring the unpleasant sweat soaking through my undershirt. Meanwhile, Kay, speaking in his usual ponderous manner, began to reveal his feelings, word by word. It was unbearable. I felt that the agony was written all over my face as plainly as a giant advertisement. Kei I'd have missed this, but he was so focused on his own matters that he had no time to notice my expressions. His confession maintained the same tone from beginning to end. It was heavy and dull, making it feel immovable. While half of my mind was listening to his confession, the other half was constantly in turmoil, wondering what to do. Thus I barely registered the details of what he was saying, but the tone of his words resonated strongly within me. This added not only to my previous suffering, but also gave rise to a kind of fear. I began to feel that he was stronger than me. When Kei finished speaking, I couldn't say anything. I didn't ponder whether I should make a similar confession or whether it would be better to keep it to myself. I simply couldn't say anything. I didn't even feel like speaking. At lunch, Kei and I sat opposite each other. The maid served us, and I finished my meal, which tasted worse than usual. We barely spoke during the meal. I didn't know when the wife and daughter would return. Chapter 37. We retreated to our rooms after lunch, avoiding each other. I knew I should confess my feelings to Kei, but the timing seemed off. I regretted not interrupting Kei's confession earlier, missing my chance. Now it felt awkward to bring it up again. My mind was in turmoil, unable to settle. I hoped Kei would reopen the conversation, but he remained silent. His stillness only added to my frustration. I wandered aimlessly around the house, unable to sit still, and eventually left to walk through the bustling streets, my thoughts consumed by Kei. Despite my aimless wandering, I couldn't shake off my thoughts of him. Kei remained a mystery to me, his sudden confession and intense feelings baffling. I knew he was strong and sincere, but his behavior now seemed incomprehensible. I felt both fear and fascination towards him, unable to decide my next move. As I wandered through the streets, I couldn't stop thinking about Kei, feeling like I was under his spell. Returning home exhausted, I found Kei's room as quiet as ever. Chapter 38. Soon after I returned, I heard the sound of a rickshaw arriving. The rickshaw stopped at the gate. I was called for dinner about 30 minutes later, finding Madame and the daughter's festive clothes scattered in the next room. They had rushed back to prepare dinner for us, but neither Kei nor I was in the mood to appreciate their efforts. We exchanged minimal, listless greetings. Madame noticed and asked if something was wrong. I said I felt unwell, which was true. The daughter asked Kei the same question, and he replied he didn't feel like talking. The daughter, puzzled, suggested he must be deep in thought. Kei's face turned slightly red. That night, I went to bed earlier than usual. Madame brought me some soba water around 10 p.m., concerned about my health. She found my room dark and quietly entered, her lantern casting a faint light from Kei's room. Seeing I was awake, she insisted I drink the soba water, which I did reluctantly. I lay awake, my mind racing. I suddenly wondered what Kei was doing. Half unconsciously, I called out to him. He responded, and I asked if he was still awake. He said he was about to sleep. I asked what he was doing, but he didn't answer. Instead, I heard him preparing his bedding. I asked the time, and he replied it was 1:20 a.m. I then heard him blow out his lantern, plunging the house into darkness. My mind remained alert in the darkness. I called out to Kei again, and he responded. I expressed my desire to discuss his earlier confession, but Kei hesitated, giving a reluctant response. Chapter 39. Kei's reluctance persisted the following days. He didn't bring up the topic again, and neither did I, partly because there were no suitable opportunities. We needed Madam and the daughter to be out of the house to have a private conversation. This situation frustrated me, and I grew increasingly anxious. I observed the household, but there were no changes in Madam or the daughter's behavior. Kay's confession seemed limited to me alone. This realization provided some relief, and I decided to wait for a natural opportunity to discuss the matter rather than forcing it. School resumed, and our routines returned to normal. From an outsider's perspective, nothing had changed between Kay and me, but internally we both harbored our thoughts. One day, I directly asked Kay if he had shared his confession with anyone else. He assured me he hadn't, which reassured me. I trusted Kay despite his past deception with his guardian. I then asked Kay how he planned to handle his feelings, whether it was just a confession or if he intended to pursue it further. Kay remained silent, avoiding a direct answer. I pressed him for honesty, but he only stated he had nothing to hide without revealing his intentions. One day I entered the school library searching for a specific article. As I was engrossed in my reading, Kay approached and asked if I was studying. He suggested we take a walk together. I agreed, and we left the library, walking through Ueno Park. During our walk, Kay brought up the topic of his feelings again, seeking my opinion on his situation. Kay's behavior seemed out of character, revealing his vulnerability. He admitted feeling ashamed of his weakness and confusion, seeking my unbiased opinion. I pressed him on his indecision, asking if he could withdraw his feelings if necessary. He struggled to answer, simply stating his pain. Seeing his anguish, I felt a mix of sympathy and conflict. If the object of his affection had been anyone else, I would have comforted him wholeheartedly. However, given my own feelings for the daughter, I couldn't offer him the same support. Chapter 40. One day, I went to the school library for the first time in a long while. I was sitting at the corner of a large table, half my body bathed in the light streaming through the window, flipping through new foreign magazines here and there. I had been assigned by my professor to research certain topics in my major by the next week. However, I couldn't find the necessary information, so I had to keep borrowing and exchanging magazines 2 or 3 times. Finally, I found the paper I needed and started reading it intently. Suddenly, from the other side of the wide table, someone called my name in a small voice. I looked up and saw Kay standing there. He bent over the table, bringing his face close to mine. As you know, in the library, you can't speak loudly enough to disturb others. So what Kay did was quite normal, but at that moment I felt a strange sensation. Kay asked in a low voice if I was studying. I replied that I was doing some research. Even so, Kay didn't move his face away from mine. In the same low voice, he asked if I wanted to take a walk together. I replied that I could go if he waited a little. He said he would wait and immediately sat in the empty seat in front of me. With him there, I couldn't concentrate on the magazine anymore. It felt as if Kay had something on his mind and had come to discuss it. Reluctantly, I closed the magazine I had been reading and stood up. Kay, still calm, asked if I was done. I replied that it didn't matter, and returning the magazine, left the library with Kay. We had nowhere special to go, so we left Rigoku Town, went to Ikenohata, and entered Ueno Park. At that time, Kay suddenly started talking about the usual matter. Considering the circumstances, it seemed Kay had taken me for a walk just to talk about it. However, his attitude hadn't advanced toward any practical aspect yet. He vaguely asked me what I thought. What he meant was how I viewed him, now that he had fallen into such a romantic dilemma. In other words, he wanted my opinion on his current state. At that moment, I distinctly noticed a change in him. As I've mentioned before, Kay was not the type to be swayed by others' opinions. He was a man with the courage and boldness to forge ahead once he believed in something. Given the experience of the family incident, I clearly recognized that this was different. When I asked Kay why my opinion was necessary in this matter, he said in an unusually dejected tone that he was ashamed of being a weak person. He said he was so confused that he couldn't understand himself anymore, so he had no choice but to seek my impartial opinion. I immediately asked what he meant by confusion. He explained that he was uncertain whether to move forward or retreat. I took a step further and asked if he could retreat if he wanted to. At that moment, his words faltered. He simply said it was painful. Indeed, his expression showed evident distress. If the object of his affection had not been the daughter, I might have showered his parched face with a comforting response. I believe I was born with a beautiful sympathy to that extent. But at that moment, I was different. Chapter 41. I was watching Kay as if preparing for a match. I directed all my senses, my eyes, my mind, my body, everything bearing the name me toward Kay without a gap. Innocent Kay was as unguarded as if he had left the door wide open. It was as if I received the map of the fortress he was guarding directly from him and could slowly examine it before his eyes. Discovering that Kay was wavering between his ideals and reality, I focused on the point where I could knock him down with a single blow. I immediately exploited his vulnerability. I adopted a solemn and serious demeanor toward him. Of course, it was a strategy, but I was also in a tense mood fitting that attitude, so I didn't have the luxury of feeling ridiculous or ashamed. I first declared, "Those who lack the desire to improve spiritually are fools." These were the words Kay had used to criticize me during our trip to Boshu. I threw those words back at him in the same tone he had used. However, it was not revenge. I confess that it was even more cruel than revenge. With those words, I intended to block his path to love. Kay was born into a Shinshuji temple family. However, his inclination since his middle school days had never aligned with his family's sect. I know I lack the qualification to speak about religious distinctions since I don't know them well, but I recognize this only concerning his relationship with the opposite sex. Kay had always liked the word self-discipline. I interpreted it to include the meaning of abstinence. But when I later learned the actual situation, I was surprised to find it had an even stricter meaning. His first principle was that everything should be sacrificed for the sake of the way, so restraint and abstinence were naturally included. But even love itself, free from desire, could be an obstacle to the way. During his independent life, he often told me about his beliefs. At that time, I, who had feelings for the daughter, inevitably had to oppose him. Whenever I said him, he always looked at me pitifully. There was more contempt than sympathy in his gaze. Given this history between us, the words, "Those who lack the desire to improve spiritually are fools," must have been painful for Kay. However, as I mentioned before, I didn't say those words to demolish the past he had built up. Instead, I intended for him to continue building on it as before. Whether it reached the way or touched the heavens, I didn't care. I simply feared he might suddenly change his life's direction in conflict with my interests. In short, my words were an expression of pure selfishness. Those who lack the desire to improve spiritually are fools. I repeated the same words twice. I watched to see how they would affect Kay. Fools, Kay eventually replied. I am a fool. Kay stopped dead in his tracks and stared at the ground. I was startled. I felt as if Kay, in that instant, had become a stand-and-deliver thief. But then I noticed his voice was notably weak. I wanted to observe his eyes, but he never looked at me. Then he slowly began walking again. Chapter 42. As I walked alongside Kay, I silently waited for his next words, anticipating them like a trap. At that moment, I didn't mind deceiving him if necessary. But if someone had come to me and whispered that I was being cowardly, I might have snapped out of it. If Kay had been that person, I probably would have blushed in front of him. But Kay was too honest, too simple, and too good-natured to scold me. Blinded, I forgot to pay him the respect he deserved and instead exploited his vulnerability. I intended to use that to defeat him. After a while, Kay called my name and looked at me. Naturally, I stopped walking. Kay stopped too. For the first time, I could look directly into his eyes. Kay was taller than me, so I had to look up at him. In that stance, I directed my wolfish heart at the innocent lamb. Let's stop talking about it, he said. There was a strange sadness in his eyes and words. I couldn't respond immediately. Then Kay rephrased his request as a plea. Please stop. I gave him a cruel answer, attacking him like a wolf biting a lamb's throat at an opportune moment. Stop? It wasn't me who brought this up. It was you who started it. But if you want to stop, that's fine. Just saying it won't be enough. You need to stop it in your heart. What do you intend to do about your usual principles? As I said this, the tall Kay seemed to shrink before me. Though stubborn, he was also honest. When severely criticized for his contradictions, he couldn't remain calm. Seeing his state, I felt relieved. Then he suddenly said, "Determination?" And before I could answer, added, "Determination? It's not impossible." His tone was more like a soliloquy or words spoken in a dream. We ended our conversation there and headed towards our lodgings in Koishikawa. Though it was a warm day with little wind, it was winter, so the park felt lonely. Especially when I looked back at the groves of cedars, their brownish green, frost-bitten tops standing against the dark sky, it felt as if the cold was biting my back. We hurriedly crossed the twilight Hongo Plateau, descended into the Koishikawa Valley, and climbed the hill on the other side. It was only then that I started to feel some warmth under my coat. We barely spoke on the way back, probably due to our haste. At dinner, the wife asked why we were late. I replied that Kay had taken me to Ueno. She expressed surprise at our outing in the cold. The daughter asked what we went to see in Ueno. I simply said we had taken a walk. Normally reticent, Kay was even quieter than usual. Neither the wife's conversation nor the daughter's laughter elicited any real response from him. He swallowed his food quickly and left for his room before I had even finished eating. Chapter 43. In those days, words like awakening or a new life didn't exist. But the reason Kay didn't abandon his old self and rush headlong in a new direction wasn't that he lacked modern thinking. He had a past so valuable that he couldn't throw it away. It could be said that he had lived until then for that very reason. So the fact that Kay didn't immediately pursue the object of his love doesn't prove that his love was lukewarm. No matter how intense his feelings were, he couldn't act recklessly. Without the opportunity to be overwhelmed by an impulse that would make him forget everything, Kay had to pause and reflect on his past. As a result, he had to continue on the path his past indicated. Moreover, He had a stubbornness and patience that modern people didn't have. I believed I understood these aspects of his character well. The night after we returned from Ueno was relatively peaceful for me. After Kei retreated to his room, I followed and sat by his desk, deliberately engaging him in trivial conversation. He seemed annoyed. My eyes probably glowed with a sense of victory, and my voice certainly had a triumphant tone. After warming my hands by the brazier for a while, I returned to my room. In all matters except this, Kei surpassed me, but at that moment I felt I had nothing to fear from him. I soon fell into a calm sleep. However, I was suddenly awakened by someone calling my name. I saw that the partition door between our rooms was partially open, and Kei's dark figure was standing there. His room was still lit. The world changed abruptly for me, and for a moment I could only stare blankly at the scene. Kei asked if I was already asleep. He was always a late riser. I asked if something was the matter. Kei replied that it wasn't anything important. He had just wondered if I was asleep or still awake. His face and expression were hidden from me by the light behind him, but his voice was calmer than usual. Kei then closed the partition door. My room, Arb? It turned to darkness. I closed my eyes again, seeking a quiet dream. I knew nothing more until morning. But the next morning, when I thought about the incident, it felt strange. I wondered if it had all been a dream. At breakfast, I asked Kei if he had opened the partition door and called my name. Kei confirmed that he had. When I asked why, he gave no clear answer. Eventually, he asked if I had been sleeping well lately. I found it odd. That day, our schedules aligned, so we left the house together. The incident from the night before had been on my mind since morning, so I questioned Kei again on the way. However, he still didn't give a satisfactory answer. I pressed him, asking if he hadn't intended to discuss the matter. Kei firmly denied it, reminding me that he had said, "Let's stop talking about it at Ueno." Kei had a sharp sense of pride in such matters. Realizing this, I suddenly remembered the word determination that Kei had used. That word began to weigh on my mind with a strange force. Chapter 44. I was well aware of Kei's decisive nature. I also fully understood why he was so hesitant about this particular matter. Essentially, I was confident because I knew the general character and firmly grasped the exceptional case. However, as I mulled over the word determination in my mind, my confidence gradually faded and began to waver. I started to think that maybe this situation wasn't an exception for Kei. I began to suspect that he had a final solution in mind to resolve all his doubts, anguish, and torment. Re-examining the word determination in this new light, I was startled. If I had fairly reconsidered the content of his determination then, it might have been better. Sadly, I was narrow-minded. I interpreted his words to mean that he intended to advance towards his love. I convinced myself that his determination was to act decisively in the realm of romance. Listening to the voice in my heart that said I needed a final decision as well, I immediately mustered the courage. I resolved to act before Kei, and without his knowledge. I quietly awaited the opportunity. But even after 2 or 3 days, I couldn't seize it. I thought of speaking to the wife when Kei or the daughter wasn't around, but the right moment never came. I grew increasingly frustrated. After a week, unable to bear it any longer, I feigned illness. Despite being urged to get up by the wife, the daughter, and even Kei, I merely gave vague responses and stayed in bed until around 10 o'clock. I waited until the house was quiet and then got up. Seeing my face, the wife immediately asked what was wrong and advised me to stay in bed, offering to bring food to my bedside. With no actual illness, I couldn't stay in bed. I washed my face and ate breakfast as usual in the living room. The wife served me from across the long brazier. Holding the bowl, preoccupied with how to broach the subject, I probably looked like a genuinely unwell patient. After finishing my meal, I started smoking. Since I didn't leave, the wife stayed by the brazier, adjusting the kettle and cleaning the brazier's edges. I asked if she had any special plans. She said no, then asked why I asked. I said I had something to discuss. She asked what it was and looked at me. Her tone was so light, almost as if she couldn't grasp my mood, that I hesitated to speak further. After awkwardly fumbling with words, I finally asked if Kay had said anything unusual recently. The wife looked puzzled and asked, "What?" Before I could answer, she asked, "Did he say something to you?" Chapter 45. After denying it initially, I felt uncomfortable with my lie. I clarified that it wasn't specifically about Kay, as I hadn't been asked to convey anything. The wife replied with, "I see," waiting for me to continue. Realizing I had to speak up, I suddenly said, "Madam, please let me marry your daughter." The wife didn't seem as shocked as I had anticipated, but remained silent for a moment, gazing at me. Having made the request, I no longer cared about being stared at. "Please, let me marry her," I repeated. "I want to marry her." The wife, older and more composed than me, asked, "But isn't it too sudden?" I responded, "I want to marry her right away," to which she laughed and asked if I had thought it through. I explained that although my request was sudden, I had considered it for a long time. There were a few more exchanges, which I don't remember. The straightforward wife was easy to talk to in such situations. She said, "All right, I'll give her to you. I'm not in a position to boast about giving her away. Please, take her. As you know, she's a pitiable child without a father," she added, asking me to take care of her. The matter was settled simply and clearly. It probably took no more than 15 minutes. The wife didn't impose any conditions, nor did she see the need to consult relatives. Saying a refusal later would suffice. She stated there was no need to confirm the daughter's intentions, implying that she wouldn't give her away if the daughter disapproved. Returning to my room, I felt uneasy about how smoothly things had progressed. I even doubted if it was genuinely okay. Nonetheless, the thought that my future was now decided refreshed me. Around noon, I asked the wife when she would inform the daughter about our conversation. The wife, showing a surprising practicality, suggested doing it right after the daughter returned from her lessons. I agreed and returned to my room. Sitting at my desk, I imagined their conversation, which made me restless. Finally, I put on my hat and went outside, meeting the daughter at the bottom of the slope. Surprised to see me, she asked if I had recovered, to which I replied affirmatively and walked away towards Suidobashi. Chapter 46. I walked from Sarukucho to Jimbocho and turned towards Oguwamachi. Normally, I strolled around this area to browse second-hand bookstores, but that day, I had no interest in old books. My mind was preoccupied with thoughts of home. I recalled my earlier conversation with the wife and imagined the daughter's reaction. These two thoughts drove me forward. Occasionally, I stopped in the middle of the street, wondering if the wife had already told the daughter. Other times, I thought the conversation might have ended. I eventually crossed Manseibashi, climbed the hill to Hongo, descended Kikuzaka, and finally reached the Koishikawa Valley. My path traced a lopsided circle through 3 districts, yet I hardly thought of Kay during this long walk. Reflecting on it now, I still don't understand why. Perhaps my mind was so intensely focused on one thing that it forgot Kay. My conscience should never have allowed me to forget him. My conscience regarding Kay returned when I opened the gate and entered the house, passing through Kay's room. As usual, he was reading at his desk. He looked up at me, but didn't ask if I had just returned. Instead, he asked if my illness had healed and if I had gone to the doctor. At that moment, I felt an urge to bow and apologize. The impulse was strong. If Kay and I had been alone in the wilderness, I would have undoubtedly obeyed my conscience and apologized on the spot. But there were others in the house, and my natural reaction was restrained. Sadly, that impulse never returned. At dinner, Kay and I faced each other again. Knowing nothing, Kay was just somber and did not cast suspicious glances at me. The wife seemed happier than usual. Only I knew everything. I ate leaden food. The daughter did not join us at the table. When the wife prompted her, she responded from the next room that she would come soon. Kay looked puzzled and asked the wife what was wrong. The wife smiled and glanced at me, saying the daughter was probably embarrassed. Kay, still puzzled, asked why she would be embarrassed. The wife, smiling, glanced at me again. From the beginning of the meal, I had guessed the situation from the wife's expression, but I feared she might reveal everything to Kay. Fortunately, Kay remained silent, and the wife refrained from revealing the details I feared. I returned to my room relieved, but still troubled about how to approach Kay. I crafted various defenses, but none were sufficient to face Kay directly. In the end, my cowardice made me avoid explaining myself to Kay. Chapter 47. Several days passed with constant unease about Kay weighing heavily on my mind. I felt I had to address the matter somehow. The wife's tone and the daughter's behavior, which seemed to prod me constantly, made it even harder. The wife, with her somewhat masculine temperament, might reveal the matter to Kay at the dining table. The daughter's increasingly noticeable behavior toward me could arouse Kay's suspicion. I realized I had to inform Kay about my new relationship with the family. However, recognizing my ethical shortcomings, this task felt extremely difficult. I considered asking the wife to inform Kay on my behalf when I wasn't present, but if she revealed everything, it would still be humiliating. Asking her to fabricate a story would lead to questions, forcing me to expose my weaknesses to my future wife and her mother. My serious nature saw this as a threat to my future credibility. Losing any amount of trust before marriage seemed an unbearable misfortune. In essence, I was either a fool who slipped while trying to be honest or a cunning man. Only heaven and my heart knew my true nature. But in trying to step forward, I found myself in a position where my slip would have to be exposed. I desperately wanted to hide my mistake while feeling compelled to move forward. This internal conflict left me paralyzed. 5 or 6 days later, the wife suddenly asked if I had informed Kay. When I replied no, she scolded me for it. Her words that surprised me that day remain vivid in my memory. No wonder he looked so strange when I told him. It's not right for you to remain silent when you're so close. I asked if Kay had said anything in response. The wife replied that he hadn't. However, I pressed for more details. The wife had no reason to hide anything and recounted everything. According to her, Kay received the news with remarkable composure. Upon hearing about the new relationship between the daughter and me, he merely said, "Is that so?" He wife said, "Please be happy for them." Kay smiled faintly and congratulated her before leaving. Just before opening the tea room door, he asked when the wedding would be and remarked that he wished to give a gift but had no money. Listening to this, I felt an overwhelming sense of suffocation. Chapter 48. Counting the days, it had been over 2 days since the wife informed Kay. During that time, Kay showed no change in his behavior towards me, and I hadn't noticed anything. His composed attitude, even if only superficial, was admirable. Comparing myself to him, he appeared far superior. I may have outsmarted him, but I lost as a human being, was the feeling that churned within me. I imagined Kay must have been contemptuous of me, causing me to blush with shame. However, the thought of facing Kay and being humiliated was too painful for my pride. On a Saturday night, as I debated whether to proceed or stop, I decided to wait until the next day. But that night, Kay committed suicide. Even now, recalling the scene makes me shiver. I usually slept with my head to the east, but that night, for some reason, I had my head to the west. Perhaps it was fate. I woke up to a cold draft from my pillow and saw the partition door between our rooms partially open, just like that previous night. But this time, Kay wasn't standing there. I instinctively propped myself up and peered into his room. The lamp was dimly lit. The bed was laid out, but the quilt was tossed aside and Kay was lying face down. I called out to him, but there was no response. I called again, asking if something was wrong, but still Kay didn't move. I got up immediately and went to the threshold, surveying the room in the dim light of the lamp. My initial reaction was similar to when Kay had first confessed his love. My eyes became like glass eyes, losing the ability to move as soon as I took in the scene. I stood frozen. Once that passed, I realized I've made a terrible mistake. A black light of inevitability illuminated my future, casting a grim glow over my entire life. I began to tremble. Yet, I couldn't forget myself. My eyes fell on the letter on the desk, addressed to me. I tore it open in a frenzy, but found nothing I had anticipated. I had expected words that would make it unbearable if the wife or daughter read them. But after a quick glance, I felt a sense of relief. Though it was only superficial, it felt like a significant reprieve in that moment. The letter was simple and rather abstract, stating that Kay was weak-willed and saw no hope in his future, so he was committing suicide. He briefly thanked me for taking care of him and requested that I handle things after his death, including apologizing to the wife for causing trouble. He asked me to inform his family. Everything was stated succinctly, with no mention of the daughter. Realizing he had deliberately avoided mentioning her, I felt a sharp pang. The most poignant part was a line added at the end, wondering why he hadn't died sooner. With trembling hands, I put the letter back in its envelope and left it conspicuously on the desk. Turning, I noticed the bloodstains on the partition for the first time. Chapter 49. I suddenly cradled Kay's head in my hands, wanting to see his face. But when I tried to lift his head and look beneath, I quickly let go. It wasn't just out of fear. His head felt incredibly heavy. I stared at his cold ear and familiar short-cropped hair for a while. I felt no urge to cry. I was simply terrified. The terror wasn't just from the sight before me, but from the fate Kay's death symbolized. Without thinking, I returned to my room and began pacing. My mind commanded me to keep moving meaninglessly. I felt I had to do something, but was also paralyzed by the sense that nothing could be done. Like a bear in a cage, I kept pacing. Occasionally I thought of waking the wife, but the idea of showing a woman such a horrifying sight stopped me. I couldn't bear to shock the daughter. I resumed pacing. I lit my room's lamp and kept checking the clock. That clock moved unbearably slowly. Though I couldn't pinpoint when I had awoken, I knew dawn was near. Impatient for the morning, I felt tormented by the thought of an eternal night. We usually woke around 7, with school starting at 8. The maid would wake at 6 to prepare. That day, I woke the maid before 6. The wife, hearing my footsteps, reminded me it was Sunday. I asked her to come to my room. She followed, wearing her housecoat over her nightgown. Entering my room, I immediately closed the partition and told her softly that something terrible had happened. She asked what it was, and I indicated Kay's room with my chin, saying, "Don't be alarmed." I told her Kay had committed suicide. She turned pale and stared at me in silence. Then, without thinking, I knelt and apologized. "I'm sorry, it's my fault. I've wronged you and your daughter." I hadn't planned to say this, but seeing her face, I felt compelled to confess. Unable to apologize to Kay, I felt I had to apologize to the wife and daughter. My spontaneous confession was more an expression of my natural self than my usual compose. Fortunately, the wife didn't interpret my words deeply. Pale-faced, she consoled me, saying, "If it was an unforeseen incident, there's nothing to be done." Her face, however, was etched with shock and fear. Chapter 50. I felt sorry for the wife, but I stood up and opened the sliding paper door that I had just closed. At that moment, it seemed that the oil in Kay's lamp had run out, and the room was almost completely dark. I turned back, holding my lamp, and stood at the entrance, looking at the wife. She peered into the 4 tatami room from behind me as if hiding, but she did not enter. She asked me to leave it as it was and open the rain shutters instead. After that, the wife's behavior was as competent as you would expect from a soldier's widow. I went to the doctor's place and the police station as instructed by her. Until these procedures were completed, she did not allow anyone into Kay's room. Kay had cut his carotid artery with a small knife and died instantly. There were no other noticeable wounds. The blood splattered on the sliding paper door, which I saw in the dim light of a dream, was evidently from his neck. In the daylight, I looked again at the traces, astonished by the force of human blood. The wife and I cleaned Kay's room as best as we could. Fortunately, most of the blood was absorbed by his bedding, so the tatami mats were not heavily stained, making the cleanup easier. We moved his body into my room, arranging it as if he were merely asleep. Then I went out to send a telegram to his family. When I returned, incense was already burning at Kay's bedside. The smell of incense struck me as soon as I entered the room. In the incense smoke, I saw the 2 women sitting quietly. It was the first time I had seen the daughter's face since the previous night. She was crying. The wife's eyes were also red. I, who had forgotten to cry since the incident, was finally drawn into the mood of sorrow. The sadness in my chest brought an immense sense of relief. The anguish and terror that had gripped my heart were momentarily soothed by that sorrow. I sat silently beside the 2 women. The wife told me to offer incense. I did so, and then sat quietly again. The Achter said nothing to me. Occasionally, she exchanged a few words with her mother, but it was only about immediate matters. There was no room to talk about Kay's life. Even though I felt relief that they had not seen the horrifying scene of the previous night, the young and beautiful daughter would have been deeply affected. The thought that her beauty might be marred by such horror was a constant worry for me. Even when my own fear had reached its peak, I couldn't act against that thought. When Kei's father and brother arrived from the countryside, I suggested where to bury Kei. We had often walked together near Zoshigaya, and Kei had liked it there. I jokingly promised to bury him there if he died. Although I doubted how much this fulfilled my promise, I wanted to kneel by his grave and renew my penance every month. Considering that I had been the one looking after Kei all along, his father and brother agreed to my suggestion. Chapter 51. On the way back from Kei's funeral, a friend of Kei's asked me why Kei had committed suicide. Since the incident, I had been tormented by this question countless times. The wife and daughter, Kei's father and brother who came from the countryside, acquaintances to whom I sent notifications, and even newspaper reporters who had no connection to him, invariably asked me the same question. My conscience pricked with pain every time. I heard a voice behind the question, urging me to confess that I had killed him. My answer was the same to everyone. I merely repeated the content of Kei's letter addressed to me without adding a single word. After hearing my answer on the way back from the funeral, Kei's friend took out a newspaper and showed it to me. As we walked, I read the part pointed out by the friend. It said that Kei had developed a pessimistic outlook and committed suicide after being disowned by his family. I said nothing, folded the newspaper, and returned it to the friend. He also told me that there were newspapers that said Kei had gone mad and committed suicide. Being busy, I had little time to read newspapers, so I was unaware of such reports, but they had been on my mind. I feared articles that might trouble the household. Most of all, I feared that even the daughter's name, though just her name, might be mentioned. I asked the friend if there were any other articles. He replied that he had only seen those two. It wasn't long before I moved to the house where I now live. The wife and daughter disliked staying in the previous place, and I found it painful to relive the memory of that night every day, so we decided to move after some discussion. About 2 months after moving, I graduated from university without incident. Within half a year of graduating, I finally married the daughter. From the outside, everything seemed to have gone as expected, and it was a cause for celebration. The wife and daughter seemed genuinely happy. I was happy too. But my happiness was shadowed by a dark cloud. I feared that this happiness might ultimately lead me to a tragic fate. When we got married, my wife, she is no longer the daughter, suggested for some reason that we visit Kei's grave together. I was inexplicably startled. I asked her why she suddenly thought of such a thing. She said that Kei would be pleased if we both visited him together. I looked at my wife's face, which knew nothing, and felt a deep chill. Only when she asked why I was making such a face did I realize it. As she wished, we went to Zoshigaya together. I poured water on Kei's new grave and washed it. My wife placed incense and flowers before it. We bowed our heads and clasped our hands in prayer. My wife must have intended to tell Kei how we had ended up together and make him happy. In my heart, I kept repeating that it was my fault. At that time, my wife caressed Kei's grave and remarked on how splendid it was. Although the grave was not particularly remarkable, my wife likely wanted to express her appreciation because I had personally gone to the stonemason to choose it. Comparing the new grave, my new wife, and Kei's newly buried white bones beneath the ground, I could not help but feel the mockery of fate. Since then, I decided never to visit Kei's grave with my wife again. Chapter 52. These feelings towards my deceased friend lingered indefinitely. I had feared this from the beginning. You could say that even my long-awaited wedding was conducted under a cloud of unease. Yet, as a human being unable to foresee my own future, I also harbored a faint hope that perhaps this could be the start of a new life for me. However, once I actually faced my wife as a husband day in and day out, that fragile hope was shattered by harsh reality. When I looked at my wife, Kay would suddenly appear to haunt me. It was as if my wife stood between Kay and me, binding us together endlessly. Finding nothing lacking in my wife, I wanted to distance myself from her in this one regard. As soon as this showed in my attitude, it reflected immediately in her heart, though she did not understand the reason. Occasionally, my wife would confront me, asking why I seemed so troubled, or if something was bothering me. When I could laugh it off, it was fine, but at times my wife's temper flared. Eventually, she would say things like, "You must dislike me," or "You must be hiding something from me." Each time it pained me. I considered confessing everything to my wife many times. However, just as I was about to, some force beyond myself would suddenly come and restrain me. You will understand this without needing an explanation, but I will state it explicitly. At that time, I had no intention of adorning myself before my wife. If I had laid bare my soul to my wife with the same pure heart as I did with my deceased friend, she would undoubtedly have shed tears of joy and forgiven my sins. The fact that I didn't do this was not out of any selfish calculation. I simply could not bear to mark her memory with a dark stain. To me, the thought of defiling her pure memories, even with a drop of ink, was unbearable. Even after a year, my heart, which could not forget Kay, was constantly restless. To dispel this unease, I tried to immerse myself in books. I began studying with a fierce intensity, hoping for the day when I could present my findings to the world. However, forcing oneself to create a goal and waiting for its fulfillment is inherently insincere and unpleasant. I could not keep my heart buried in books. I found myself again folding my arms and gazing at the world. My wife seemed to observe that it was because I was not struggling to make ends meet that my spirit became slack. With enough property for the two of us to live on without hardship, both her family and I had no need to seek employment. This perspective was somewhat understandable. I may have been somewhat spoiled. However, the primary cause of my stagnation did not lie there. After being deceived by my uncle, I deeply felt the unreliability of others, but still had confidence in myself. No matter how the world was, I believed firmly in my own integrity. This belief was utterly shattered by Kay. When I realized I was no different from my deceitful uncle, I began to waver. Having lost faith in others, I lost faith in myself and could no longer move forward. Chapter 53. Unable to bury myself in books, I tried to drown my sorrows in alcohol. I do not claim to like alcohol, but I could drink heavily, so I relied on quantity to numb my mind. This shallow method soon made me even more pessimistic. In the middle of my drunken stupor, I would suddenly become aware of my position. I realized I was deliberately acting foolishly to deceive myself. This awareness would jolt me awake, body and mind. Sometimes, no matter how much I drank, I could not enter this state and would sink further into despair. Moreover, after artificially buying pleasure, there would inevitably be a depressive backlash. I had to show this side of myself to the people I loved most, my wife and her mother, and they interpreted it naturally from their perspective. My mother-in-law would sometimes say awkward things to my wife, who would hide them from me. However, my wife felt compelled to confront me on her own. She would not rest until she had expressed her discontent, yet her words were never harsh. I rarely became agitated by anything she said. She often asked me to tell her frankly what was bothering me. She advised me to stop drinking for my future. Once she cried and said, "You have changed recently." That alone was fine, but then she added, "If Kay were alive, you wouldn't be like this." I once replied, "That may be true." But my meaning and her understanding were completely different, which made me sad. Even so, I could not bring myself to explain anything to her. I sometimes apologized to my wife, usually the morning after returning late, drunk. She would smile or remain silent. Occasionally she would shed tears. No matter her reaction, I felt unbearably uncomfortable. Therefore, apologizing to my wife was essentially the same as apologizing to myself. Eventually, I stopped drinking, not so much because of her advice, but because I grew tired of it myself. Although I quit drinking, I still had no motivation. With nothing else to do, I read books. But even when I read, I would set them aside unfinished. My wife often asked why I was studying. I would just smile wryly. Deep down, I felt sad that even the one person I loved and trusted most in the world did not understand me. I had the means to make her understand, but lacked the courage to do so, which made me even sadder. I felt lonely, often feeling as if I were living alone, cut off from the world. At the same time, I repeatedly pondered the cause of Kay's death. At first, my mind was entirely consumed by the idea of love, leading me to conclude that Kay had died from heartbreak. However, as my mind settled, I realized that this explanation was too simplistic. The clash between reality and ideals was also insufficient. Eventually, I began to suspect that Kay had suddenly resolved to die because he, like me, felt unbearably lonely. This realization filled me with dread. I sensed that I was walking the same path as Kay, which began to cross my mind like a gust of wind. Chapter 54. In the meantime, my mother-in-law fell ill. The doctor diagnosed it as incurable. I nursed her with all the care I could muster. This was partly for the patient herself, partly for my beloved wife, but ultimately it was for humanity. I had always wanted to do something meaningful, but had been unable to act, resigned to inaction. This was the first time I extended a hand and felt the satisfaction of doing something good. I was driven by a kind of atonement. My mother-in-law passed away. My wife and I were left alone. She told me that she had only me to rely on from now on. Unable to rely on myself, I looked at her and was moved to tears. I thought of her as an unfortunate woman and even said so out loud. She asked why. She could not understand my meaning, nor could I explain it to her. She cried, believing that my constant cynical observation had led me to say such things. After her mother's death, I treated my wife with as much kindness as I could. It was not just because I loved her. My kindness seemed to stem from a broader background, just like when I nursed her mother. My heart moved in the same way. My wife appeared content. However, her contentment seemed to include a vague, thinly veiled point of dissatisfaction arising from not understanding me. Even if she had understood me, this sense of incompleteness would likely have remained. Women seem to value personal attention over broader humanitarian love, even if it means disregarding some obligations. Once, my wife asked if men and women's hearts could ever truly become one. I replied vaguely that it might be possible when young. She seemed to reflect on her past and let out a faint sigh. From around that time, I occasionally experienced terrifying flashes in my mind. At first, they seemed to come from outside. I was startled and frightened. But over time, my mind began to respond to these flashes. Eventually, it felt as if they had been lurking in my heart since birth. Every time I felt telling his way, I wondered if there was something wrong with my mind. However, I did not want to see a doctor or anyone else about it. I deeply felt the weight of human sin. This feeling drove me to visit Kay's grave every month, to nurse my wife's mother, and to be kind to my wife. It even made me want to be whipped by a stranger. As I went through these stages, I began to think that I should whip myself rather than be whipped by others. Eventually, I felt that I should kill myself. I decided to live as if I were dead. How many years have passed since I made that decision? My wife and I have lived happily together as before. We have never been unhappy. We were happy. But the one point that was so significant to me always seemed dark to her. Thinking of that, I felt deeply sorry for my wife. Chapter 55. My resolve to live as if I were dead was occasionally jolted by external stimuli. But whenever I tried to break out of my shell, a terrifying force would come from somewhere, gripping my heart tightly and preventing any movement. This force would tell me that I was unworthy of doing anything, and I would immediately wilt at those words. When I tried to rise again, I would be gripped once more. I clenched my teeth and shouted at the force, asking why it interfered. The mysterious force laughed coldly, saying, "You know the reason well," and I would collapse again. Please understand that my inner life, which seemed calm and uneventful, was always fraught with this painful struggle. Before my wife saw my frustration, I had already endured it countless times over. When I could no longer remain stagnant in this prison or break through it, I felt that the easiest course of action was to commit suicide. You may wonder why, but the mysterious, terrifying force that always came to grip my heart allowed me no path forward except death. If I remained still, it was bearable, but any movement forward led inevitably to that path. I have attempted to take the easiest route led by fate several times. However, I was always held back by my attachment to my wife. Of course, I lacked the courage to take her with me. Given that I could not reveal everything to her, the idea of sacrificing her life along with mine was too horrifying to contemplate. Just as I had my destiny, my wife had hers. Bundling us together and setting us alight seemed not only impossible, but also excessively cruel. Imagining my wife alone after my departure filled me with pity. When her mother died, she said she had no one but me to rely on. I remembered her words deeply. I always hesitated, feeling relief at the thought of stopping whenever I looked at her face. Then I would freeze again, often receiving looks of dissatisfaction from her. Remember this, I have lived in this way. When I first met you in Kamakura, when we walked in the countryside together, my feelings had not significantly changed. The black shadow was always attached to me. For the sake of my wife, I dragged my life through the world. When you graduated and returned home, it was the same. I was not lying when I promised to meet you again in September. I genuinely intended to see you. Even as autumn passed, winter came and winter ended, I was determined to see you. Then, in the height of summer, Emperor Meiji passed away. I felt that the spirit of Meiji began and ended with the emperor. I, who had been profoundly influenced by Meiji, felt that surviving beyond that era was out of place. I told my wife this clearly. She laughed it off, but then, unexpectedly, suggested that I should commit seppuku. Chapter 56. I had almost forgotten the word junshi, suicide to follow one's lord in death. It was a word I had no use for in daily life, so it had sunk to the bottom of my memory, almost rotting away. When I heard my wife's jest, I remembered it and replied that if I were to commit junshi, it would be for the spirit of Meiji. My response was also a joke, but at that moment I felt as if I had imbued an old, unnecessary word with new meaning. About a month later, on the night of the imperial funeral, I was sitting in my study as usual when I heard the signal cannon. To me, it sounded like the final farewell to the Meiji era. Later, I realized it also signaled the passing of General Nogi. With the extra edition in hand, I instinctively told my wife, "It's junshi, junshi." I read in the newspaper what General Nogi left behind before his death. When I saw the phrase saying he had resolved to die since losing his flag to the enemy during the Satsuma Rebellion and had lived until now to atone for that, I unconsciously counted the years on my fingers. The Satsuma Rebellion was in Meiji 10, and it was now Meiji 45, a span of 35 years. General Nogi had apparently spent these 35 years wanting to die, waiting for the right moment. I wondered whether those 35 years of wanting to die were more painful, or the moment of driving a sword into his abdomen was more painful. A few days later, I finally decided to commit suicide. Just as I could not understand General Nogi's reasons for dying, you might not fully grasp my reasons for suicide. If that is the case, it might be due to the differences in people born in different eras, or perhaps due to the differences in individual personalities. I have tried my best to make you understand this enigmatic me through my narrative. I am leaving my wife behind. Fortunately, she will not have to worry about her living expenses after I am gone. I do not want to give her a cruel shock. I plan to die in a way that she will not see any blood. I will quietly disappear from this world without her knowing. After my death, I would like her to believe that I died suddenly. I would even be satisfied if she thought I had gone mad. It has been more than 10 days since I decided to die. Most of that time has been spent writing this long autobiographical section for you. Initially, I planned to meet and talk with you, but writing it out has made me feel that I have been able to portray myself more clearly. I am not writing out of drunken whimsy. The past that created me is a part of human experience that only I can speak of truthfully. I believe that my effort to document it without falsification is not a futile task in understanding humanity, for you or for others. I recently heard a story about Watanabe Kazan, who delayed his death by a week to complete a painting called Handan. It may seem like an unnecessary effort from the outside, but it is said that he had a corresponding inner necessity. My effort is not only to fulfill my promise to you, more than half of it is driven by my own inner need. But now I have fulfilled that need. There is nothing more for me to do. By the time this letter reaches your hands, I will no longer be in this world. In particular, I will be dead. My wife went to her aunt's place in Ichigaya about 10 days ago. Her aunt is ill and needed help, so I encouraged her to go. I wrote most of this long document while she was away. Whenever she returned home, I would hide it immediately. I intend to provide my past, with all its good and bad, as a reference for others. But please understand that my wife is the sole exception. I do not want her to know anything. My only wish is to preserve her memories of the past as pure as possible. Even after my death, as long as she is alive, I ask you to keep everything I have confided in you as a secret within your heart. This concludes our reading of Kokoro by Natsume Soseki. We have uploaded various other English readings of Japanese literature, so please subscribe to our channel and check them out. Goodbye for now.